Okay, everyone, are we ready? Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me here today on this important discussion. So when the decisions came down last week and they were all back to back, it sort of shook me. I was very ecstatic and happy, right? So when the decision came down on the LGBTQ employee rights, I was happy, and it was sort of it was a situation where the day before or the evening before, I was speaking to a friend of mine on the phone, and I was explaining to him that I knew someone who actually was, I'm not sure if he actually filed it, but trying to garner to put a brief in support of the other side because of religious freedom. And I remember feeling really upset, like, you know, you're a Black person, you are Muslim in this country as I'm Muslim, and you are actively putting in a brief requesting discrimination against somebody else's right to have a job. And I was just speaking to my friend the day before, reminding him about this situation that I knew about and how just disheartening it was, and that how do we, in our mind's eye, think that's okay, right? Especially for us, for those of us who look like we do, and for those of us who are, especially in this environment, have the sort of stigma that we also have. And then the next day, the decision came down, and my friend sent me a text, "Look what came down." And I was just like, what? And it was just so amazing and exciting. And all I could think was, this is what changes people's lives, right? Because this is the kind of thing that really matters. And then, of course, the DACA decision, and I was just in heaven last week. Despite all the pandemic stuff, I was in heaven, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I was about to just go online and start talking and just be like, you know, but then I started thinking to myself, really? We just gonna start talking? Can we put something cohesive in place, please? So of course, who did I think of? I thought of Amaha, and I thought of Patrice on UndocuBlack and African Communities Together. I couldn't think of another group of people, folks to really reach out to who can speak to a lot of the audiences that I have and a lot of the communities that I interact with and who are affected. So, and I was so happy that Patrice was able to get you, Jerome, because although I was ecstatic about this decision, I can't really identify per se and speak. I can identify only as a person, as a Black woman who's an immigrant in this country and who's also Muslim, and the things that come along with that. And I really needed someone like you to speak to what it means for that decision coming down. And I needed Amaha and Patrice, who have been on the forefront, on the ground, fighting for immigrant rights, to talk about the DACA decision and really lay it out for us what it means and what it doesn't mean, and talking about the fight that still needs to happen, right? And I'm gonna start with Amaha, who is our go-to person when it comes to fighting for the African immigrant rights. So he's based in New York, however, he goes where he's needed. Here in the DMV, he even helped, you know, with some by immigration, but he helped group of airport workers to be able to get their pay, their proper pay. And so it's beyond just doing immigrant rights work or immigration, but helping people who otherwise would not get the help, people who otherwise nobody speaks of, you know, and who doesn't get a camera. And African communities together has done that and is doing that. And Amaha, welcome. And I'm so happy to have you here. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion because I always learn more. I may be an attorney who practices immigration, but you are really on the ground. Oh, my girl, I was waiting to see you before I spoke about you. I was not going to speak to your picture. I was going to speak to Patrice herself.
Hi, y'all. Hey, Cheryl. Long time no see.
My people.
Shirt on.
Look at you. My people, we are here. I am so happy to see all of you. So, Amaha, can you give us just a little bit of rundown on the DACA decision and what, as African communities together, is the next step?
Yeah, thank you, Fatmata. And it's a pleasure to be on with you. And, you know, I mean, you said very kind things about me and about ACT, but, you know, you've been doing this work before there was an ACT in our communities. And, you know, it's been a pleasure to partner with you on, you know, everything from TPS for Guinea, you know, Liberia, Sierra Leone, you know, DACA, just, you know, sort of wave after wave of these fights to make sure that our communities get included in immigration policy. So maybe I'll start with, maybe I can start with a little bit of the kind of what exactly happened, like the legal questions. And then maybe Patrice, you know, UndocuBlack actually has worked far more extensively in some ways on the DACA issue specifically, and you know, they can talk about some of what's next pieces. So as you said, Fatmata, we don't always expect much from this court. And, you know, most of the time we get what we expect, but sometimes we get pleasantly surprised. So this was a challenge to the Trump administration's effort to terminate DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this is a program that grants kind of long-term but temporary status to certain immigrants. And, you know, as people, you know, a challenge to the Trump. Oh, and I think as people know, it extends that relief specifically to immigrants who came to the U.S. as children, who sometimes get called dreamers, but who arrived when they were children, although, you know, none of them are children now. And, you know, this is something that undocumented immigrants fought really hard for, sat in, you know, Obama administration campaign offices, you know, and you know, it was really the product of many years of struggle to get this program enacted. And the Trump administration, very early on, moved to unilaterally end the program. As they've moved to unilaterally end a lot of other programs like TPS, Temporary Protected Status, for countries that had had it for decades in and out of, you know, Democratic and Republican administrations alike. And they said, you know, we can do this under our power as the executive branch, as, you know, a presidential authority. And what the Supreme Court said this past week was, no, you can't. Yes, you ultimately have the right to end this program because it wasn't enacted by Congress, but it was, you know, enacted by the president. But that doesn't mean that you can do it without any notice and without any proper process. We have a law in this country called the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA. And it's an important part of how laws get made and get changed in this country. And, you know, Fatmata, you'll relate to this. And there was a moment in law school when I had to choose, because of my course schedule, between taking refugee law and taking administrative law. And I chose refugee law. And more these days, I regret not taking that admin law course, because everything comes down to the admin law, and everything comes down to this APA act as much, or as in particular. So what the Supreme Court said in their decision is, first of all, we have the power to rule on this, which the Trump administration had said, oh, this is a purely political, purely executive function. And court said, no, it isn't. We have the right to decide what the law is in this area. And they said, you may have the power to end DACA, but you don't have the power to do it without going through the correct process. You have to put something in the Federal Register. You have to state your reasons for doing it. Those reasons can't be what's called arbitrary and capricious, which they said, the reasons that you cited when you ended DACA are arbitrary and capricious. You didn't give good reasons for doing it. And you have to accept public comments. Those are the steps that you've got to go through. And you didn't go through them. So go back to the drawing board. So that's where we are now. It's gone as far as it can go in terms of the Supreme Court. But Patrice may speak to this next, that doesn't mean that they couldn't say, fine, we'll do that process. Now, whether they can do that before the end of this term is unlikely, right? Like, it's unlikely that they can do something before January 2021, which means that we have a little bit of breathing room. But they still get to go, end the program. But the court said, if you're going to try to do that, you have to do it the right way.
Yeah, I just never take away from like the fact that this administration will try whatever it is that they possibly can to just screw everything up. Like, I excuse language because we're on a live, but like, it's my Jamaican is coming out because it's late in the day and I'm just frustrated when I think about this. It's just like, everything they can possibly throw away, because one of the main things that we've been asking for in terms of the demands is, one, they need to take renewals, right? And they've been doing renewals, but what they do with renewals is like, if you try to renew it ahead of time, for instance, and it's too far in advance, then they cut the amount of time you're supposed to get for the renewal. So let's say you're supposed to renew and it was like, I don't know, let's say it expired in December and you applied from now, they will give you the renewal, but it's not gonna be for 2 years, as in December 2020 to December 22, they cut it. And so it's going to be from June 2020 until whatever. And so they cut the time. And, that's just messing up with people's money. And so I'm really excited about this decision and I want us to celebrate and all this, but I'm also on guard with the fact that they're going to screw us up, right? Like, and, with the Liberians, we got through with Liberian DEDs, Amahaka and sharing all this, right? We got green cards. Ask me how much of them they've actually accepted. How many of them have they approved? They've gotten over 1,000 since January, and not one person has gotten a green card yet. Why? You know what I mean? And then they're supposed to tell people, like, so many people were eligible for DACA, right? Or could be eligible for DACA and did not even know the program existed. And that existed from Obama, who, like, everybody loves to praise. And Obama didn't do a good job telling people this shit existed. Man, I'm alive. So you shouldn't do this stuff for Mata. Go to Jerome. Let him tell us.
Okay.
No, and honestly, too, like, just thinking about what you're saying to Patrice is thinking about like where the education for all these things were coming from, right? And a lot of it, while we didn't have the education in our communities, for whatever reason, there's conflict in our communities, and we know that, right? And so things happen in siloed ways, but like coming from the top down, there wasn't enough education, and the pushes that we were asking for were just like, we'll give you this crumb here, and maybe next week we'll give you that one, and then tomorrow we'll also add this crumb just to like appease you. And to Omaha's statement around like, we have a little bit of time between now and January, but we know this administration loves to pull a surprise. And out of nowhere, where we think they don't have the time to, they're working on that back end real hard in that White House trying to figure out which and how and which way they can push this information to get what they actually want. And it's amazing for a lot of us who've been doing this work for a very, very long time that we continue to think about, while they're trying to figure out how to screw us over on the back end, we also are going to figure out how to stop them from screwing us over, right? Like, I remember being one of those young people who was eligible for DACA and was told I wasn't, right? And so I was just like, I don't know where to get this information. What am I going to do? And that's millions of other Americans, right, who were in my exact position, who were completely eligible, but just didn't have the knowledge to do it. Keeping in mind of how slow they process things, because now they're talking about furloughing a bunch of workers from USCIS, which means that the system is going to be even more severely impacted. And all of these applications from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago are going to be pushed even further back. Yep. And so it frustrates us as people in the community doing this work, because it's like, while we're trying to find the resources to get people the representation and to get people the information that they need, then we get hit with the other side where it's like, now we're going to pull more resources from over here so that these folks can wait longer. It's a truly sugar, honey, iced tea, TY situation, but
it's very frustrating. It's a frustrating situation. So since Jerome is speaking, and I've sort of talked about the fact that Patrice is with UndocuBlack, and I was gonna wait to introduce Jerome before he speaks, because I love your bio and the work you have done. You're such an amazing young man. So very quickly, so that when you listen to this young man, you see where he's coming from and you understand where he's coming from, okay? So Jerome lives in New York. He's Bayesian. He's from Barbados, right? He's from Barbados.
All the island people over here.
And he's been here since he was 16 years old, and he has worked at the intersection of IPV, economic empowerment, HIV/AIDS, and immigration. He is part of, make sure I say it correctly, okay? Correct me if I say it wrong, okay? The Black LGBTQ Migrant Program.
IA plus.
Thank you. Since I love education. Education is so important. IA plus program.
Yes, migrant
program, right? Perfect. So he has already been working in this and has been advocating for people just like himself. And so when you hear him speak, he's speaking from personal experience, and he's speaking from the work that he has done at the front lines. Thank you. And I would ask people to really listen to when Jerome speaks, because these will be statements made by someone who actually can personally speak to them. It's not intellectual like some of us, right? It's not speaking from up here somewhere and sort of analyzing, to analyze these decisions, but not just to analyze them in an intellectual way, but to also marry between what Jerome has experienced and is experiencing and has worked towards, and the work that people like Patrice and Amaha have done on the grassroots part. And I want to be able to marry the decision as far as LGBTQ employee rights with the idea of working as a DACA recipient, and looking to see how the impact is on someone like yourself, Jerome, someone like yourself who has both experiences, right? Who has the ability to tell us what it's like to not just be a DACA recipient, but to be that person who was watching the case in Supreme Court where somebody's trying to say, well, I can't tell you, I'm not going to hire you because of who you are, basically, right? And so, Jerome, can you give us sort of your perspective and your experiences when it comes to that aspect of marrying the two?
I think it's a really important intersection to think about, right? Because when you're talking about the intersection of employment and also the intersection of immigration, those are two very, very unique topics that people tend to silo out of the two, right? Because they feel like as immigrants, you don't have the right to work, you don't have the right to do, et cetera, et cetera. And that narrative kind of follows you along as you go. So even when you're in your immigration journey, right? And for example, you get your work permit and now you're trying to apply for jobs, it's this piece of information that you know in the back of your mind, and you're just like, I'm gonna go apply to this job, they're gonna hire me because I'm great. And then it's another layer of like, oh, but you're an immigrant, oh, but you only have this thing, and you only have a work permit and it's only for 2 years. And then there's all this like, we can't hire you because the uncertainty, right? For me, I spent a lot of time in my life and like just advocating around like what it feels like for me as a Black person and an immigrant person. And trying to navigate and always fighting systems, even fighting with employers around what this actually means, right? And why they should be hiring folks who look like me in these spaces, right? And why we should have the opportunities to sit at the same tables that everyone else is sitting at. It's not an easy fight, and it's not a fight that people tend to listen to a lot, because all of the narrative around just immigration seems to be the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant narrative, or we don't deserve it, or you're taking our jobs, or whatever else is happening. And it really is to say, like, you know, we just have to think about what migration really means for us and helping folks to understand what migration actually is. We're not just coming to America because there's all these jobs. We're fleeing because we're hungry. We don't have a place to live. We don't have water. We don't have food. We can't find work. And for some of us, we're fleeing just to safely love who we love. And that's hard, because then you get here and it's the same exact things. We fall right back into the same system of, we don't have food, we don't have water, we don't have protection. And it becomes the same cycle. And then folks kind of like take that into consideration and sit back and be like, but I don't understand why this is all happening. You understand why this is all happening. We live in a system that just treats us as poor people like we are expendable, like we don't matter. And so you are always going to hear our voices fighting. You're always going to see us at the forefront of these things, right? Just during the midst of a pandemic, right? We're having this conversation. I just had this conversation on another panel that I was on, where folks were asking me, like, how does it feel as a migrant person and as a Black person in this country during a pandemic where things are just like falling apart? And I'm like, for me, that is a very scary experience. But I cannot imagine what it's like for someone who is completely undocumented right now with absolutely no access to any of the things that I have to keep me safe, right? I can't think about I can think about the person who doesn't have a place to stay, who hasn't even filed any kind of paperwork with immigration and is still trying to survive. I've lived that life for a long time, and it's not easy, right? It takes years of self-advocating, and sometimes I had to do this on a lens that I didn't even know, right? And that's for many of our folks who come into this country. We have to start from the bottom, where we have no idea where to go, who to talk to, what to turn to, where to get the answers. Even if we got answers, the information may be 6 years post-dated, and that's the most recent. And so for me, it's really about marrying all this information and making sure not to silo things, but talk about it in the context of why they're together and the importance of why they should be together. Because once you start to separate, you're stretching resources, and it becomes a lot harder for people to engage in the conversation when they just can't think about everything in two separate things. So when you put it together, it's simple. A lot of these things and a lot of these skills are interchangeable. It's really just how you marry that language, and also how it's presented.
So what would you say to people who, first of all, I should have done this first. Can you tell us what BLMP is?
So the Black LGBTQIA plus Migrant Project, BLMP is a national organization. And a lot of the work that we're doing is really connecting our Black migrant families across the diaspora together, right? And we're bringing all of our folks together just to talk and provide the information, provide whatever support that we can in terms of if it's legal support, if we need to talk to folks around housing, if we're providing political education. It's really a space that we are creating to build the community that we want to see, right? And to build the the narrative around immigration, that it's not something that's siloed into a specific community, but it affects all of us across the diaspora, right? And specifically for Black queer migrants who's completely left out of all of these conversations, that's where we want to make sure our folks are being held and contained in a way that makes them feel visible and wanted and needed in this community. And we continue to do that in many different ways. A lot of our work right now is talking around policy. There's currently a survey that BLMP's pushing, and it's a national survey just collecting some information from our Black queer folks around their healthcare, around housing, what they see, what they want. And this data that we're creating is then gonna help us to be used to then further push the policies that we're asking for, right? So it's supporting all the DACA conversations, the TPS conversations, all the work visa conversations, because we didn't have that data. And so a lot of our work right now is just like focusing on building that, so that as a community, we have the data to fall back on when they're like, but we don't know, we need statistics.
Right.
We got y'all.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. That's good. That's really, really good. So I wanted to go back a little bit because I really wanted to get Jerome's perspective a bit on the intersection between the DACA and the decision on the employee, the LGBTQ plus employee decision. So, Amaha, can we speak very quickly on this groundbreaking decision on LGBTQ employee rights and the fact that it even happened, the fact that it even happened and it even came out of this court, and the you know, I was reading through the dissent a little bit, and you know, but I wanted to speak to you about what you think propelled, because I've been having conversations with people, and one of the things I was saying is that I feel like this court is sort of going in the direction of the country, because the country is moving more left. And slowly, but it's moving. And the general public sentiment is not as conservative as it used to be when it comes to everyone's equal rights, for people to be treated equally, for equity to be shared appropriately. And so what do you think about how this decision came to be, and how you think Roberts was able to sort of shift over and join the other liberal judges?
Yeah, I think that shift that you're talking about is really essential, right? I mean, I think you know, there's a stereotype of kind of activist judges and activist courts that are really pushing the envelope of social change. And I think the reality is that the courts trail social change. They follow behind social change. And at best, they institutionalize victories that have already been won through kind of political struggles. And so what you're seeing in this Supreme Court decision is, you know, by a conservative majority, right? Like, you know, where we have a 5-4 majority, and you have the Chief Justice who's, you know, broken with his conservative colleagues. What you're seeing is decades, really, since the, you know, in some ways since the 1950s, but, you know, more since, you know, the late 60s and the Stonewall Uprising, you know, generations of people who started with, you know, we, first of all, you know, with winning very basic, you know, things like, we don't want to be criminalized for who we have a relationship with. We don't want to be incarcerated for who we have a relationship with. And then, you know, moving towards more areas of equal rights under law, you know, whether that's marriage, whether that's, you know, the right to be in other institutions. And this is, you know, it's not the final frontier, but it's you know, it's a really significant one. And I think, you know, just as, you know, as an immigration lawyer and practitioner, there's what people think the law says, and then there's what the law actually says, right? And so people think that immigrants have all kinds of rights that they don't actually have under the law, right? And similarly, there's people think that there's all kind of rights LGBT folks have under the law that they don't. And one of them is the right to not be fired for what for who you have a relationship with, right? I think if you ask that, if you went out and did person on the street surveys with most people, would be like, of course, Chick-fil-A can't fire you because you have a boyfriend or you have a girlfriend. Like, of course not. That's of course that's 100% illegal. But it's not, or at least it hasn't been. And so what the court did was interpret existing laws relating to gender-based discrimination as applying to discrimination based on sexual orientation. And this is something that a lot of legal scholars had been arguing for some time, saying, of course it's gender-based discrimination, because if it were, if the gender of the person being discriminated against were different, then you wouldn't, then this wouldn't be happening, right? Like, you wouldn't be firing this, a woman for having a husband when you're firing a man for having a husband. But again, up till now, the courts had not gone along with that theory. So again, this is the courts paying attention to what's happening in federal legislation, in state legislation, at the local level, mass movements, popular culture, all of the places where, this struggle about whether LGBT folks have full humanity and full equality under the law have been waged for generations.
It's amazing that that's even a question, right? A human being. And the fact that it took us this long. It's 2020, we're about to probably enter 2021, right? But it's because I was reading Kavanaugh's dissent, and he seemed to focus a lot on the fact that there have been attempts to, in Congress, in the Senate, the House, different attempts to prohibit employment discrimination for the LGBTQ plus community. And the fact that they have yet to come together to do one, right? So in his analysis, that means that the civil rights law does not apply, because if it did, then you would need to have created a different law to, so it's almost like saying that since now we have constitutional amendment that gives us as Black people we're human, so that means we don't need to have the lynching laws that we're trying to put into place now to outlaw lynching, because but don't you know, you're already human, so we don't lynch human beings, except for the fact that you have, and you continue to do so. So it was interesting to me reading that, and I'm probably planning to do like a really deep dive into how the dissent came to be with Kavanaugh, especially since he's supposed to be the one that goes through the letter of the, right? So he's supposed to be that person that looks at the law in the way it's written. So the civil rights law clearly says sex, right? It applies. So the fact that he even wrote his dissent sort of, threw me just a little bit. But Patrice, on UndocuBlack, you guys have been fighting to put the Black immigrant voice forward. And because we all know that when you speak of immigrants in this country, or the immigrant fight, the picture is not really the Black immigrant, correct? So I'm really proud of the work that UndocuBlack has done, and I'm so proud of the fact that we've collaborated so much over the last few years. And I am amazed at what you guys have done up to this point. So we have these policies in place. Now we have the DACA decision coming down, and we have all this marches happening, right? The Black Lives Matter moving forward. And I wanted you to sort of speak to the how we can use the Black Lives Matter movement in conjunction with really pushing forward the Black immigrant narrative and show the humanity of the Black immigrant and the real struggle of the Black immigrant, and that an immigrant in this country is also a Black person, and how we can use the Black Lives Matter, or rather support it, in addition to having to support your fight with UndocuBlack Network.
Yeah. And and we've talked a bit with like Movement for Black Lives, and they have a whole policy platform, right? So distinctly to kind of mention, like, BLM, Black Lives Matter, is separate from Movement for Black Lives, which does more of the policy and that type of legwork and the demands. And they have some awesome organizers over there that have been doing all sorts of stuff, which is amazing. Our national platform, local platform, this past week, Carissa, and, all these folks that have been like really throwing down and, making very clear. And from when they even released that policy platform, and Jerome, you may remember, they had Black immigrants in it. They have had it in it from jump. They've talked about the layers of interaction with police and this and that, and it just wasn't catching on. Like, people just weren't paying attention. And so we do hope that this moment creates more of that. I know, like, internally we're having more conversations ourselves and more community calls about abolishment, about all these different pieces that we know, we understand, but don't always have the shared language around or about, right? But we have the stories. We can tell you how scared we are if we're driving and police come behind us. We can tell you how many people in our families have been detained, deported, are in prison, all of that, and but we need to also make sure we have the language as well that share that, okay, these are our demands, and we're going to stand up for it. I think there are two pitfalls that I'm really worried about, and I mean, I'm with friends, even though we're on the internet. One is the fact that, unfortunately, being Black means that you blend, right? Unfortunately, being Black and immigrant means that you blend. Even Black immigrant, queer, no matter what, like, the first thing they see is a Black person, and then afterwards they figure out what are your sub identities that they can attack you on, right? And unfortunately, we were looking up, UndocuBlack talks a lot about mental wellness and mental health and all this stuff. And we're looking into how many Black immigrants were actually accosted in the midst of having a mental health crisis. And either their family member called the police, and, we were sold so many lies about America. It's not that we don't know not to trust the police. But, we were told that America is different. They look out for you, and so we have mummies and grandmas and whatever thinking, yes, I can just shake the kid right, and, the police will come and they'll help, only for the police to come and kill your child, right? And I think that's just happened so many times. So we end up having to do a re-education of the community, a retraining, an unlearning of the things that we thought we believed, to say, well, this is not safety. This is not working for us. And as much as we've been told, keep your nose clean, head down, and you'll get by, that's not working. It's not working for us, right? It has not worked from so many of us. If that was the case, we'd be able to go home. We'd be able to see our families, and we can't, right? And we've done all that they've asked of us, and we still can't do those things. We can't work. We can't see our families. We can't live. We can't be. And then at the same time, we blend in with everybody else. So they're like, oh, well, you don't actually have a problem. But yeah, we do, because once you start to dig deeper, we have issues as well. So that's one, is the blending issue. The second one, quite frankly, is this fad I appreciate that everyone has sent out some Black Lives Matter statement. It's beautiful. We ourselves have not, because we are it. If you didn't know, well, here you go. But like, how long is it really going to last? And how, like, show me your boards. How many of your boards are Black people? And I'm talking to the immigrant organizations, right? How many of your boards are Black people? How much of your senior leadership is Black people? Your advisors? What languages? And Amaha hones this down and hammers this in every conversation. What languages are your materials in? Because, friend, if your materials are only in Spanish and English, well then that's not it, right? And I know we mostly have our materials in like English, and then we'll have translators here or there. We ain't got the budget these people got. They got hella budget. And what are you using it for? Like, what are you using it for? Like, you go through these painstaking ways to make sure you have translation, but you're only appealing to one subset of the population. And that's just one gripe, but there's just so many more. So, you know, I was on a few calls earlier this week, and I was telling people, I was like, listen, you want to partner with us? That's wonderful. You want to partner with Black organizations? So great. But I'm going to need you to go through an anti-racism training first. You know, there is a great one I talk about all the time, Muslim art. They're really good at dealing with white people. They've got the patience. I don't. Pay them and, you know, let them teach you how to do this work and how to interact with folks. And I'm really hoping people will take that step. But I am worried because it requires a level of humility. It requires understanding that this is not a sprint. It requires you to put your money where your mouth is, and time, and a process that, you know, I think in this world of instant gratification and pat on the back and instant rewards, I'm very worried about how many organizations and how many people are going to pick that up.
Thank you so much. So what do we have as next steps as far as the DACA is concerned? Either Patrice or Amaha can respond to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Jerome.
I wanted to add a little bit to what Patrice is saying, because I think that's a really important piece of, like, as we talk about this work and moving this work forward,
yeah,
we really have to start thinking about where people are putting their money, right? Because it's great to go online and look up an organization and hit donate, but that's what else are you doing? How are you really redistributing your wealth? And how are you really making sure that you're ensuring equity for Black folks across the board, right? Not just hiring Black folks in your board and on your staff and in your leadership, but making sure that these are directly impacted Black people that you're sitting at this table, right? Making sure that if you were an immigrants' rights organization, and see how I use the quotes there, because that's a whole nother conversation. If you're an immigrants' right organization, your staff and your board should not just be brown folks. And I'm just gonna name it as that, right? It shouldn't just be a subgroup of one set of people. It's crazy, like Patrice is talking about, as a Black person, you get roped into just being a Black person. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been in Black spaces and organizing spaces. And when I say that I'm a migrant person, people are literally shocked. Like, they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go, they're like, what? Black people can be immigrants? So, right, Patrice's statement around, we really have to do the education, and not us. The education has to be done from the bottom all the way up and the top all the way down. It's just that important for people to understand that asking us to provide that labor, not okay. Also asking us to continue to come into your spaces and educate y'all on why you need to be less anti-Black, not okay. That is not our job. And it shouldn't be our job. It's your job to do that. Y'all have all the access and all the budgets to make it happen. Provide the proper education so that folks can get it. And while we're on the conversations of defunding, let's also remember that when you're talking about defunding, that just means money's being moved, right? And so when some people are talking about defunding, what they really mean is abolition. And so folks really need to figure out where they are in that conversation and how they fit in, and if that's really where they want to be based on the end goal, right? Because we can't just say defund the police and then they just move all the money into ICE, and now all of a sudden ICE is running around like they're the police. Like, we really have to think about the weight of our demands, right? And how many people that affects. was it you, Patrice, that was talking about Black Lives Matter? It's the same thing, like Black Lives Matter. I heard this narrative even today where folks are like, but this was started by queer folks and I don't understand. And I'm like, this happens in a moment of whirlwind when the statement itself becomes a trend and so many people have got included in the message that now we decide to silo people. So now you're gonna see a hashtag Black Trans Lives Matter or Black Queer Lives Matter or Black Immigrants Matter, or because there's no real place for all of this to be created in a container for it to happen. And the sooner we stop segregating these things, because at the end of the day, the thing that brings us all together in this moment is that we're Black first.
Gotcha.
Right? They're gonna see all the other things. There are gonna be many different intersections. And sometimes you could look at a person, some people look at me and they're like, I don't know what's going on there. They just see a Black person. They don't know if I'm queer, straight, if I'm alien, they don't know. And so we can't just go based on what we're seeing. We really have to understand that some of us live our lives at intersections that we don't even know that we're at, right? And that's a hard place for some of us to be in, but making sure that the movement is inclusive enough of folks to see that their voices can be heard. Because Patrice is right. We were at the tables at the very beginning with all these conversations, and we kept screaming and shouting and telling people immigrant lives matter and Black immigrants are existent and we're here. And it wasn't happening. So guess what started happening? We decided we're going to create our own tables and bring our people together and have these conversations. ACT is one of the many organizations who we look up to and have always been looking up to, UndocuBlack, BLMP. A few of other folks out there are really trying to connect those dots that are falling through and filtering through to make sure that they can catch people and hold them in those places. And I think that's really important for us to think about as we try to move this work. It's figuring out how collectively we're not recreating the same things that have been happening, because it's a lot more energy on folks. As people are coming into the movement, as fast as they're coming in, they're going out. And so we really want to make sure we can keep people's interest and keep the momentum going, so that at least when we're having these conversations, it doesn't get tiring. It doesn't feel too much on us. We don't feel happy after we have these conversations. It's a growing and learning process.
So before I came on, I was speaking to a friend of mine who is part of the ACLU here in Montgomery County. I think she's either one of the chairs, I believe. But don't quote me. And so I was telling her about this, and she has, you know, like many of us, one of the million Zoom calls at the same time. So she wouldn't have time to log on. But she showed a lot of interest, especially when I spoke about you, Jerome, and what you do, and the BLMP and so on and so forth. And she was very, very interested. So for people like that, right, who may not necessarily be exposed to the work that you guys are doing and the education that you're attempting to do, how do they, because the reality is you only know what you know, right? You don't know what you don't know, right? So how do we bring people like that in to where they are able to gain knowledge from someone like yourself, Jerome, Patrice, Amaha, people who are on the ground and people who can speak personally to the struggles and can teach those who otherwise would have absolutely no idea of the experiences and what steps they need to take? Because people many times, you know, would, with a good heart, you know, try to do, but it's almost tone deaf, right? And so how do we get them in and help them with what you're saying in such a way that they're able to take the message and internalize the message and use that message to do what it is you guys are just talking about?
I think the first step is really for folks who are interested in these conversations, they first have to get comfortable in sitting with discomfort, right? It's going to be uncomfortable, a lot of what you're going to hear. And it's uncomfortable for us to even say some of these things, but it's going to be uncomfortable. You have to sit with that. Part of that is coming into the conversation with thinking this conversation is being brought to me with the best of my intent, with the best intentions, be it the person who's presenting, and I'm also going to come into this space with the best intentions. The other piece of that is also remembering that when you're coming into these spaces, they're sacred spaces that we built for us. And so you have to come into this space and respect that space first and foremost, and allow the space to be what it's going to be and learn from that. As you are learning from that, whatever information is coming out of that space, you are respectfully making sure that that information isn't doing any further harm in the ways that you were continuing to talk about it, right? We don't close our spaces to folks, but we will let you know this is who's centered in this space, and that's who's always going to be centered in those spaces. And the sooner that folks can realize, okay, this is how this is working, folks will get more comfortable in coming in and learning, right? Because folks aren't going to come in and ask us 1,000 questions. What they really want to know is, how are you surviving? How are you building? And then when folks are asking questions around like, what can we do next? It's really talking about not only what you can do next, because a like is cute, a share is cute, a post is cute, a tweet is real great. But if you are not willing to come into the trenches and have those conversations, if you are not willing to put your bodies on the line when we need you to do that, if you are not willing to use your vote to really speak for this community, that doesn't go anywhere. It just stops at a certain level of you getting the information, and we have to continue to do that education again. So it's really, once you get that info, what do you do with that? How do you take that back? How do you share this? Who do you talk to now? How do you bring more people in? How do you sustain this work? It really is about putting those pieces together, but also with the respect to like, this is who this community is. This is all the work that is held and shared here. Respect it, and also like grow from it and learn from it. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's not our place to make you comfortable. None of us have ever done that. I don't know in which immigrant rights movement ever on this globe we decided to make people comfortable. It's not about making you comfortable. For as long as we can care, we don't care. F your borders, F your walls, F all of that. Like, we just want to make sure that we can be safe. And so we want to make sure we create those spaces and keep them contained with the respect to the struggles that folks are going through.
Okay. Amaha and Patrice, any one of you to jump in to talk about next steps for DACA and our undocumented immigrants, and how we can help. Because of course, you know, someone like myself, was a dreamer before dreamer was a dreamer, right? So I was a dreamer before dreamer was a dreamer, and know the difficulties of living in two worlds, right? You're in a limbo. When you're home, you're in my case in Sierra Leone. When you leave, you're a Black child in America, but your experiences, and I wrote that somewhere, your experiences is you're a Black child, an American Black child, but you're not Black American because your papers don't say you're Black American, but you're treated as a Black American until you open your mouth and you start speaking. And then there's, then of course, being that subset, there's another added difficulty that comes along with it. But being that child, and I didn't have my green card until I was going to law school, literally. Like, I grew up in this country. I came here in the 80s, and I did not get my green card until I was going to law school. And many of us go through that life thinking we're okay, but we are really not. And at any time, something could have happened in a split second, and your whole world flipped upside down, and things are just never the same again. And your compatriots, your companions don't have your experiences, because there's an added layer to being a Black child in America. There's an added layer to being an undocumented Black child in America. So then now you have that to deal with. So when I see the fights that people like yourself and UndocuBlack going through, and I see the struggles of our dreamers today, and how much more in danger they are than I was in the 80s and 90s. Because let's be real, I was in danger, but not at the level that they are now. Like, they are literally it's like there's a war being waged against them. The administration just recently said they are gonna try again within 6 months, right? To get rid of DACA again within 6 months. And we have a chance in November to get rid of these people. But are we going to be able to, is the question, right? So in the meantime, what do we do? And what can be done to protect these dreamers and others, not just the dreamers, but others who are undocumented and should have a chance to move on and have a path to citizenship?
Yeah, well, I'll lead off and then hand the baton to Patrice. I mean, I think what you're doing, like with the statement that you just made, with organizing this program, with the work that you do every day, is really the first step, which is visibility, right? We need to take our stories of survival and resilience and resistance, and we need to share them, you know, starting with small groups of folks that we trust, but then turning it into a broader public conversation, right? I feel like in our African and Caribbean and other cultures, we all have some expression that's about keep your business off the street, you know, don't stick out, you know, or you'll get beat down. Like, we all have some equivalent of that expression. And sometimes we enforce that not just on others, but on ourselves. This idea that, well, we're just gonna keep our heads down. We came here to work, not to stay. You know, especially among folks who came as, you know, maybe as older adults or, you know, what have you. And so we're not going to draw a lot of attention to ourselves. We definitely are not going to talk about our status, you know, as immigrants and as undocumented immigrants. And I think that breaking down those walls and that invisibility is really the first step. Because how is hiding in the shadows working out for us? Not particularly well. We still get targeted, right? And so I think that that's a really important step, to start to be able to have honest conversations. And when you see somebody, you know, who's out there saying, well, you know, see our you know, Black immigrant children and second generation folks, and, you know, say, you know, holding signs that say undocumented, unafraid, and unashamed, to cheer them on, as opposed to being like, you know, child, what are you doing? You know, don't put your business in the street. So I think that that's a first step. But then, you know, we need to go beyond that, and you know, educate within our community, and look at all the ways that we can take action. So for some people, maybe that's, you know, marching in the, you know, for Black lives and being part of the protests and the demonstrations. Some people may not be ready to do that, but, you know, they can respond to the U.S. Census, right? Like, and make sure that we're counted, you know, we're counted, because if we're not counted, then we don't count, right? Maybe, you know, if you've been here 15 years and you're lucky enough to have your green card, maybe it's time to think about becoming a U.S. citizen so that you can vote. You know, yeah, maybe you will retire back home, but, you know, maybe you can worry about that, you know, when it's time to retire, right? And in the meantime, you have to help make this a country where we can just survive and we can just get through the next, you know, 4, 8, or 12 years. So, you know, thinking about what is a step that I can take with the power that I have, you know, and then I think in terms of the political and legal battle beyond the Supreme Court decision. I mean, so this administration has had a goal, which it's not really to get rid of all immigrants, because if you get rid of all immigrants, who is gonna, you know, change the beds at Trump resorts, right? Who's gonna, you know, who's gonna do this, you know, critical work that kept the essential workers, you know, like that doesn't function. It's really to block immigrants, and particularly immigrants of color, immigrants from, you know, so-called S-hole countries, you know, from having access to citizenship and, you know, full participation in the life of the country. And one part of that strategy has been illegalizing large groups of people. And so DACA, people, documented, people, dreamers, people who had DACA, that's the single largest group that they have tried to revoke the temporary legal status that they have. The other group is temporary protected status holders, which is, again, hundreds of thousands of people who've had, lived here for decades in some cases, through Republican and Democratic administrations, and they, turn around and one day and say, we're terminating status for all of you. And so far they haven't succeeded. As Patrice said, we're still waiting to hear about Ramos, which is right now down at the Ninth Circuit level. It hasn't made it up to the Supreme Court yet, but we could hear at any moment. So they've been blocked so far by the courts. That's not necessarily something we can continue to count on for the long term, for the reasons we talked about before. But one thing they've succeeded in doing is creating a mass movement like we haven't seen for decades, particularly from these two groups, and to fuse these groups together, DACA people and TPS people, some younger, some older, from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and Central America. And so we, as Black immigrants, sometimes we have to fight in every room that we're in, right? Like, within the mainstream immigrant rights movement, part of the fight is going to be like, you're going to include Sudan, you're going to include Somalia, you're going to include Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. We don't care if they were terminated at the tail end of the Obama administration. They go in the Dream and Promise Act, they go in the legislation. They're TPSers too. Trump could have kept that program going, and that, I will tell you, is going to be a fight. And we were successful in getting them into the bill that passed Congress, and Patrice can tell you that was not an easy fight to make sure that they were included, and then we have to keep fighting to make sure that they stay there. So I think we have to. We need not just a different president, but we also need a different Congress, and particularly a Senate. And if we get a different president and Senate, the top order of business is, and I should clarify that any of my opinions around who we need in elected office are myself as an individual rather than the 501c3 organization that I work for. If we get that, then immigration has to be on the agenda from day one. The framework should be what the House passed, which would legalize, give permanent status to hundreds of thousands of DACA and TPS, because permanent status, permanent protection, a permanent home in the US, that is the end goal.
Yeah. Thanks, Amaha. And I can go. That was so many good points. Thanks to you and Jerome and to Fatmata. Like, you should have never told me your story now, girl. You should have never done that. Now you just became an UndocuBlack member. I'm about to start sending you community call information. Like, you shouldn't have done that. You were wrong. You were wrong, because we're multi-generational. We're always welcoming new people. I'm still planning on recruiting Amaha. Don't worry. But, I think actually what you shared is really important. I think there's different levels of engagement. If we're UndocuBlack, for the most part, we create spaces for us. So we're not asking everybody to be involved. We want Black undocumented people to have a place to be, currently or formerly. And so that's where my focus is. That's where my energy is. We'll do other talks and other this and that, but like, especially those need to be paid opportunities, right? Because that is not what we were here for. And that requires a whole nother different level of engagement. And so I'll say again, and I think Amaha and Jerome touched on it, like, people need some level of anti-racism training first. And I think that goes for all levels, right? Like, you need that first before you want to come to engage with us. Just to be kind to us. Like, if you think our lives matter, then like that's a part of self-care, is me not having to answer some of your questions that are very harmful to me, right? Number two, I think sharing even like your story, if I matter, like you might remember this event we went to recently. It was last year, was it? And
Yep.
they were all dressed up in kente cloth and, you know, well-meaning Black people, and that was beautiful. But they talked about overseas Black issues, overseas Black immigrant African issues, before they talked about the ones that were happening here in the US. And I think a part of that is the fact that we still police ourselves. Like, we still have a little policeman in our head telling us, you know, what to hold back from, right? Like, I'm how you were talking about different variations. In Jamaica, they say you come for drink milk, you know, come for cold, right? You know, you come for drink milk, you know, come for cold. And so there are all these different things about like how you keep yourself, you don't get in other people's business, you get yours, you get out. And we have to be really careful that we don't subscribe to that, and that we are telling other Black people, because I've been in conversations with people, no, they kind of know. But if they just met me, you know, they'll assume I'm like American or whatever. I have certain conversations and I'm like, actually, and at that point, you know, that's when minds are blown. But like, we need to tell people that up front, nip it in the bud up front. You say you're all about dashiki and this and that and, you know, rights. Okay, cool. Well, who are you including in that conversation? Who are you including in that narrative? Because they don't necessarily even need to come to our organizations to learn. If they dig in their own families, in their own groups, they can tell you, oh, that's why so-and-so would never smoke weed with me. That's why so-and-so would never do this, I would never do that. Like, they can tell you that they have an idea of someone who was so hyper vigilant. I remember, I have a story of a friend of mine. She came to visit me and she was trying to cross the street. And based on where she was trying to cross the street, I was jaywalking. And based on where we were, I was like, I don't do that in this part of the neighborhood. Like, I don't. And she was like, what? Why? And I was like, I'm an immigrant. Like, we don't do that. Like, you are very careful of where you're gonna go to reduce your interaction with police. Now, had she not known my story, like, she could remember that later down and be like, huh, maybe that's why Patrice didn't want to do this. Maybe that's why Patrice didn't want to do that. I mean, there are little pieces that I think if folks just really paid attention, you know one of us, you've loved one of us, you've been friends with one of us, you've been to the mosque with one of us, you've been to church with one of us, you know who we are. And so it's not that hard to go a step further to champion what you think we need. Like, we need healthcare. This bill that you're involved with and you're on the policy platform for, you're a council member for this and for that. What is the language that you're using? Are you using the word citizen? Stop using the word citizen. Are you saying that in order to get this, people are gonna need IDs? Is that really necessary? Scrap that. Like, stop policing people and putting more red tape and barriers in the way of people accessing things that you know they are inherently due. You know, clean water, a job, food, a place to live, like, and then that translates to all levels of the system. There is no reason for people to be drug tested in order to get housing. There is no reason for, like, you know, the box to still exist on employment applications. Like, when you start to dismantle other parts of the system that you say are a part of Black Lives Matter and the thing that you honor, you will help the most oppressed. Just get rid of those damn barriers.
So I actually have a question for Jerome. Someone put in a question on Facebook.
Send me a question.
So here's the question. The question is basically that if those of us who have other identities other than Black and male can rely on the hopes that our unique issues will get addressed afterwards, why do we have to wait to hear about the intersectionality?
I don't necessarily think that we're waiting to hear about the intersectionality. I think part of it is that we are unaware that there's an intersectionality there and that we're at an intersection. And so part of it is really, once we know that we're at that intersection, it's how we use our voice, our purpose, our missions, or like whatever, to really uplift and hold those pieces of our identities. And even though, like, again, we're not separating them, we're just putting them all together, because we can't exist at multiple intersectionalities, right? Like, someone can be Black, queer, immigrant, HIV positive, dealing with mental health, and all these different layers. And sometimes, in order to get what we want in society, we have to pick apart these things in order to get it. And we don't want to do that anymore, as Patrice is saying. We want to make sure that as we are building out and moving forward, that we're encompassing all those things, right? That we are keeping all of that in mind, right? It's not about separating. We're putting it all back together, and we're going with that fully, wholly, as who we are, authentically us. And that's what we're trying to make sure that the messaging is, right? We're not saying that we're just Black people. We're saying that we're Black migrants and everything else, because we're making sure that holistically that all fits in one place, and we're fighting for the whole person, not just a piece of them.
So the question, another question for, was, if we don't name the intersections, will they get seen?
So if you're not telling, like, I can't just look at you and know what intersections you were at.
Okay.
Right? It's very simple. And that's not science. It's that we can't just look at folks and assume, nor should we look at folks and assume, right? Sometimes it's worth having that conversation and really getting to know folks. Patrice made a very clear example of that, in terms of, like, some of us are friends with people who have that privilege of citizenship, and they don't know the pieces of who we are, right? But they love us, they hang out with us, they smoke, they drink, they cook, they do all these things with us, right? And they don't even know sometimes the dangers where we are. And that's because a lot of it for us is around our safety. When West Indian culture will tell you, you're going to see a man about a cow, that basically means mind your business. We're not having that conversation with you. And so for a lot of us, it's really around what is safe and what does safety look like. And so as we're having these conversations talking about building out and policy and all of that, we also need to think about what is safe and what is not safe for people. How is this? Does this equal safety? Does this put this person at risk, or does it not put this person at risk? So that some people don't feel the need to then say, here's all my intersections. They just need to show up as who they are, and we just roll with that.
Okay. Okay. So you are going to add something after Patrice, and I interrupted you with the question.
It was, Patrice was talking about, it was talking about, you know, doing that education. And I wanted to talk about the piece of anti-Blackness, because a lot of folks hear anti-Blackness and they think that only applies to white folks, or it only applies to a specific subset group of people. We have our own internal anti-Blackness that we need to work on, right? And so for some of us who are out here telling people that they need to do this work, before you tell folks that they need to do that work, we have to do that work ourselves. And that means starting that conversation in our very households before we even go out to the streets. Because there are many times where I'm having conversations with folks who I've done work with, love, know, you know, et cetera. And we're having these conversations on a personal level. And then I meet family members or their friends or like other folks that they're connected to. And the language is like, wow, I didn't even know your folks felt like this, but you felt strongly the other direction. And so it's not to call you out, it's to call you in so that that behavior gets addressed, and that as we start to build our movements and grow forward and do all these things, we're addressing those nuances so that the public facing stuff doesn't come back up, right? Because it's gonna jump out again. Somebody's gonna say something and then a statement comes out and you're like, holy shit. At the same time, you really want to think about what makes the most sense, right? If we're not starting these conversations with our own people, then how can we actually move mass movements of people to believe these things, right? It's not going to happen that easy. And so we just, again, have to get comfortable with the discomfort and really growing through that and addressing that as we go. Okay.
This is so fantastic. So I didn't have any more questions from people on the Facebook Live. So if anyone has any closing remarks that you'd want to give, so maybe websites, Facebook, contact of how we can activate what has been discussed here this evening. And ways for people who are watching and listening to help move things for both communities, and or in some cases one community, right? Because that's the whole point, right? The intersectionality of both communities, and somebody living, some folks living in both communities, and they're like that, right? And trying to figure out a way to navigate both and survive it. So I'll start with, well, whoever wants to go first, you can raise your hand. I'll let you go first and end it for us. Patrice?
Yeah, I'll go quick and wrap it up. I have two things. So one, on UndocuBlack, UndocuBlack, on all platforms, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We're not on the Snapchat or the TikTok or whatever else exists. But UndocuBlack, just UndocuBlack works. That's probably one of the best ways to get to us. And on the second thing, I just want to hone in on TPS. We showed up hella for DACA. That was great. The TPS community, your Black immigrant TPS community, your Nepali TPS community, your Latinx, Afro-Latinx TPS community will need you when we get that decision, which could happen at any moment. And so we need people to show up. Go to the Supreme Court, do your hashtags, whatever we ask you to do it. Follow our lead, because it's really important that everyone, regardless of if you are a child, and DACA, people aren't children no more, they're in their 30s, but regardless of your age, we need that support and protection. So please look out for when the TPS lawsuit drops, and follow UndocuBlack and African Communities Together and BLMP and all these groups for the things on what to do.
Okay, Jerome, can you do you have a final statement?
Yes. My final statement. So Black immigrants matter. Black queer immigrants matter, basically. You can also find BLMP on all the official channels, the Black LGBTQIA plus Migrant channel. Our Instagram, which is where a lot of our media comes out right now. That's how we're engaging a lot of folks. We also have a Facebook. But on Instagram, if you're looking for us, it's official BLMP, because we're official. Check that out. We are also, I mentioned this earlier, but we're also currently running a national survey. And the link is super easy to remember. It's a bit.ly link. So it's bit.ly/BLMP survey online. And I can send this to you, Fatmata, afterwards so that folks can get it. So basically, if folks are Black, first gen, or migrant folks, please definitely have them reach out to this survey. It's in essence a whole nother Black census just for migrant folks. And so what we're doing is trying to gather a lot of this information so that as it comes time to advocate on policy levels, that we can go say, here's our numbers, and this is what these numbers look like, and here's where money needs to go in order to protect these communities. So that when we're having these conversations around TPS, around DACA, around asylum, around all these other parts, we have the data to prove what we're actually saying. And so my piece for the rest of that is really digging deep, right? As we are moving forward and doing this work together, digging deep and sitting with the discomfort. It's not just that you're hearing it, it's sitting with it and then figuring out, how do I make this discomfort and how do I turn this into something that's going to be beneficial for all of us? I'm not going to stop fighting until all of us are free.
That's fantastic. Amaha.
Yeah, I mean, this has been such a rich conversation, and it's always just a pleasure to sit with family and talk about the important things. I mean, our sister Chimamanda talked about the danger of a single story, and I think part of our job and part of what we've done here tonight and what we have to do is sort of embrace and lift up and make visible our multiple stories, and listen to each other's stories, and then work on creating a new story together. And so like I said before, that could for different people, depending on where they sit what taking action looks like for them might be different. It might be engagement on social media, like Jerome was talking about, or participating in, BLMP's census or the U.S. Census, or any of those. But I do think that this is an extraordinary time that we're living through, and it's going to require not necessarily for us to be extraordinary people, but to do extraordinary things. And so I think that's the challenge that we need to take up. To engage with African communities together, again, we're a membership organization for immigrants from Africa and their families. We only have kind of physical engagement, well, outside of COVID quarantine, physical, face-to-face engagement in New York and the DC metro area. That's where our offices are. But we organize a lot of programs virtually, online, like this, on conference calls around the country. You can find us on most of the, social media channels, and you can search African Communities Together. That's our full name, or we're at Africans with an S, because we're plural, because all of us are plural. Africans US. So if you go to Twitter, Africans US, Instagram, Africans US, Facebook, Africans US. And our website is africans.us. Excited to continue this engagement, and, Fatmata, for you to invite us back for the next stimulating conversation like this.
Definitely, no question at all. And additionally, if you guys can just send me all the information you just kind of put out, and I will put it on the Facebook post after the conversation. That way people can see it, and they will get it at any time that they go back there. And I want to thank you. You guys have, you fed my soul tonight. I feel so learned. Jerome, you've taught me some things in the an hour and a half of being together, and I look forward to more engagement, more conversations, because like anything else, it's repetition, right? One conversation is not learned, done, right? So I look forward to more engagement and more conversations. And I'm going to steal your signature tag by James Baldwin, because I opened your email and I was like, whoa, I love this. Freedom, not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be.
That part.
I was like, that's it right there. So we continue the fight to gain our freedom. Nobody can give it to us. We have to take it, and we have to own it. And I love seeing that we are, to a certain degree, learning that our voice has power, and we're utilizing it. And it is so great that we are. Not in exclusion of others, and not being anti anyone, but pro us, right? So there's a difference between being pro you and loving you and promoting you than being anti whatever, right? So I love the work you have been doing, all three of you and others in that space. And I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. And I will be calling on you again. And so get ready, because I really believe this conversation needs to continue, and we need to expose it and be more exposed to larger crowds and larger audiences. And as we build the audience, the better it will be. And doing more outreach and making sure that it gets in the nooks and crannies of our lives. So thank you so much for joining me tonight, and I really appreciate you very, very much. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you to the other two panelists who were people who I hold dear in my life and have shaped a lot of my organizing. They don't know it, now y'all do. Thank you so much for creating
Love
this
and
space.
respect.
Thank you, Jerome. So much love and respect. Thank you all. Thank you.
All right.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Good
y'all.
night, everyone.
Good night.